David, I'd say, go. Man, am I on? Can I tell how many people we've got on, or is that all back there? Okay. Probably nobody's on yet. We'll wait a few minutes. What? I can. Usually I try to keep you in the dark. I mean, I have the slides and then I have notes. Sure. I've done the Faith, Hope, and Love series before. Actually, according to some of the pages I had, I think I did it first time back in like 1994. How many we have on, David? Just one? Okay. So we'll wait a few more minutes. Norman class doesn't start until what? 9:10? Three? Okay. Let's get two more and maybe we'll get, since our small group is supposed to be showing up en masse. For those of you online, we're going to wait a couple more minutes for a couple more people to get online, and we've still got some people trickling in. There's a marathon running through kind of the middle of Naperville, so depending on what direction you're coming from, you have to actually figure out your way to drive around the marathon this morning. Hey, David, give me a heads up when we got like 5 on. Still 3? Okay. 9:05, I'll start regardless. All right, let's go ahead and get started, and we'll kind of let people come in as they get here. First page is going to be, or first kind of comments are going to be just kind of catching up with where we are and what we're doing next anyway. So if you remember, Michael Horn spent June on faith. And then Jeff just wrapped up last week with hope, and for August we're going to finish up with love, and basically kind of come back to 1 Corinthians 13:13, which those of you who don't like 13, you're out of luck because that is what it is. I always wonder if there was something symbolic on that, but at any rate, we're at 1 Corinthians 13:13 is kind of the context for where faith, hope, and love came from, and there is some other kind of context behind that I'm going to touch on this morning. And this morning will be mostly just kind of the setup, and then we'll kind of start digging in a little bit more on some practical implications as we go. But if you remember, in terms of Michael going through faith, and I've been doing Friend Speak on Sunday mornings, so I actually hadn't been in to do any of the sessions, so I've had to listen to a couple of Michael's, and I managed to get through one of Jeff's, but mostly I was also trying to figure out how to do how to work this if there were questions or anything else that came in from online. But the idea of faith, of course, is saying yes to God as the condition for salvation. Abraham being justified by faith. Faith is the opposite of sin. I mean, the context of why faith and why that's part of the core, as we'll see, that's kind of the base that you work from. And then, hope basically being essentially no one can live without hope for long. And so hope is kind of what keeps you moving forward, even in the middle of tough times and challenges and daunting tasks. And so, there's a context around kind of why hope builds on faith. And then as we see in 1 Corinthians 13:13, love, and the greatest of these is love. I want to read just so we can kind of go back and pick up the context. And actually, I'll do it this way. I'm going to read all of 1 Corinthians 13:13 as we get started, and then that'll kind of reset things. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it's not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. The word that's used most of the way through, and there are a couple of other versions or other words thrown in, is agape in the Greek. And most of us have been through kind of the study of the types of love before, but we're going to touch on that again because it's important as we get through this and kind of see where we're headed. So if you look at those three in faith, hope, and love, there's an interesting context for those of us that, which is probably most of us, that started out with King James Version. Okay, how many of you remembered or kind of had that verse memorized? David, am I off screen? Sorry, I was all the way over here. This is my natural, thanks to about how far can I go? Right here? Okay. Sorry, we've got Arrow Bible Camp kind of spread out all over, so we're a little bit constrained this morning. Most of us probably remember the word that was used in the King James was, on the slide, charity. And you kind of wonder, like, why would the word be different in the King James Version versus today in one of the newer translations or the New International or even the New King James? it's hard to get much of a dialogue going in this environment, kind of in this room, isn't it? I watched Jeff try on that too, and it's just a little bit tough. One of the things that, sorry. Okay, well, that's a good point. It's outward focused. Now, love should be too, but the idea of charity, if you go back kind of 100 years, it had a different meaning and a little bit different context. And so we'll get into that as we go. So we're going to come back to that in terms of why that word was used. Why our current understanding or definition of the definition we would use for charity is different and doesn't actually kind of fit the translation as well anymore, but why it was used then and what the context was. So think about that a little bit in terms of what's the difference between love and charity. And again, we're going to come back to that later and kind of dig into that a little bit because it's an important difference. Again, we're going to kind of hit this too, but how many words do we have for love in English? Really just one, okay? But there were 4 Greek words. And then, if you look at that in the different context, the reason that charity was picked at the time was the context in which they were looking at the meaning of the word love and the way it was used at that point. So that's going to be kind of an interesting, I think, twist in terms of what we get there. And a little bit more on the context of the whole kind of faith, hope, love trilogy and some of the kind of background there. That trio of attributes or characteristics is, as it's highlighted at the end of 1 Corinthians. We've obviously paid a lot of attention to it over the years, and people have kind of debated the meaning and the context, and it became, kind of known as the 3 theological virtues, or in some writings, it was the super virtues. So when you think about kind of, characteristics or attributes, those are like 3 core things, right, that remained, with the greatest of these being love. But there's also a sequence there which we'll look at. So Immanuel Kant, who's a philosopher, at one point said there's kind of 3 core questions that have to be answered. What can I know? That was one of his big ones. What should I do based on what I know, and what can I hope? And the response to that from a kind of Christian, biblical, scripture perspective from some writers was faith, hope, and love are, the answers to that, which is, what can I know? Okay, that is know God. So have faith and know God. Understand our essential moral obligation from that knowledge. So that was the response to what should I do, which is, notice the wording, essential moral obligation. Right? So that puts a little bit different spin on the way we might think of love is, from a Christian perspective, it's an essential moral obligation. It is a part of what we are called to do, right? And we're gonna read John and 1 John, and I'm going to read from 2 Peter this morning, where that comes back again and again, and of course Jesus' statement as well. And then hope, what may I hope? Hope in knowing God's promises. So that was kind of the Christian response that was phrased to Kant's questions. Was we have a perfect answer at the end of 1 Corinthians 13. Which is faith, hope, and love. The hope is in God's promises. The hope is, as Jeff went through, heaven, God's promises, what does that mean, and what's the context? So that's a part of what, we're looking at is that faith, hope, and love, and that passage, continues to come up. We continue to go back to it. We've studied it, we've looked at it, but have we really thought about it, which is why Andy, I think, teed up this series on that. When we look at that, we also think that believe there's an order to it. So it was not kind of random in terms of, you know, Paul commenting on that in Corinthians and kind of doing faith, hope, and love. If you look at it, and there's a couple of different analogies. I actually have a picture of a camera tripod that has the same thing with kind of the three-leg idea. But if you look at the flower, you come down to the base, and what anchors it, what keeps it rooted, is faith. So that your faith is the base that kind of holds everything together. And oh, by the way, it actually feeds the rest of the plant as well, right? The rest of the flower. What keeps you moving forward, even in the face of adversity or challenge or struggles or dark days, is hope. That's the stem. The stem is what continues to move up and to drive growth. And then all that is topped by, the crowning glory, the flower at the top, which is love. So that metaphor actually, works, I think, pretty well. As we think about it, is we started with faith because that grounding and having that base in which we kind of are firmly anchored. Go back to the parable of the sower, right? And the seed that takes root deeply, and then you kind of build from there, but it's firmly grounded. And then basically, as we grow, we continue to kind of move up in terms of towards the light. And then basically, love is the flower that continues to bloom and grow at the top of that. Okay, we're not gonna read a lot out of James this morning, but when you look at faith, hope, and love, and this is just kind of a starter list. So the question below that is, what else can you think of in terms of other connections? But what would be the first thing James would say? Right? Faith without works of love is dead. Faith without works. Put love in the context, and it's love, if you will, that ends up driving, because love is active, not passive. And love is what, and obedience is what drives the works. So James would actually probably characterize it that way in terms of the connection between faith and love. Love not motivated by faith is not what we would term agape. So that's a little harder. How would you think about that? Anybody kind of react to that one? I pulled these together, but hope without faith love not motivated by faith is not agape. Why would I say that? We actually can have some discussion.
The other versions of the word love in the Greek is again
Four words for love.
storge or eros. Those two probably aren't necessarily so much motivated by love. Leo probably is.
Yeah.
Ultimately kind of love. But the other two, particularly like eros, that can be rather selfish.
Okay. Yeah. Eros would be, that's one of the problems with Eros, right? Is it tends to be a selfish love that is basically all kind of emotionally generated. And the idea of agape is going beyond that in terms of literally thinking about that other person first. It's their well-being. It's being concerned about them. It's not doing it as a generic response, nor even as an emotional response. It's driven by faith, trust, hope in God. And so it has a whole different context and meaning when you use the term agape and capture kind of the different meaning of that use of the word love and what's behind that, which requires, faith and hope to activate and generate, that love, which then drives the response to others, which we're going to get into. So this one's for Jeff, but hope without faith is wishful thinking. Right? I mean, if you don't believe in God, where does your hope come from? Well, you could say you don't have any hope, or your hope comes from something tied to material, physical world and elements. Maybe it's a hope that, your kids will do better, just in a more kind of generic sense, or hope in things that are transient. It's really tough when you hit struggles and your hope is in things that may be disappearing around you. Okay, and so it's kind of this connection as well back with, you want to have some respect for that, but essentially that's wishful thinking as opposed to hope and a belief that God actually cares about what's good for us, actually cares about and intervenes and is active in our lives, right? That creates an entirely different set of hope built on our faith that then generates a response in terms of love and how we deal with others. And that's what a lot of this is going to come back to. We're going to, as we go through this, we're going to look at all of the one another passages. Not all of them. We'll dip into that a little bit. We've been through that before. I mean, I know I have done communion talks and talked about one another passages more than once. And it's part of what should pull us always forward, and it's our response through love is to think about others first. I mean, we've had that discussion during the last year and a half multiple times, right? What's our first concern? Not about my rights or what I want. It's about respecting and being concerned about others, being concerned about the safety of others. And that response, which if you read Philippians and Ephesians, right, it's pretty clear. We're to be about each other, about one another. And we'll spend some time on that as well. So if we kind of move back a little bit and we say, okay, as Matthew said, you've got basically 4 words for love. In English, you've got 1. How do we generically define love in English? When we say the word love, what do we mean? When you use the word love, what do you mean? Anybody? What do you refer to when you say you love something?
You like it.
Okay, you like it? So it's a feeling of liking something. What do you like? Somebody in here I know has a great love of horses. Okay? That's a very emotional response. It's also probably, I think, in her case, more than that, but, she loves horses. We have a small group that meets on Friday night, and when a certain person brings brownies, everybody loves her brownies. So, there are things, when we use that term in English, it's, I would say, a small L, not a capital L, certainly not all 4 caps. And we use it kind of generically as a general feeling of, I really like that. Or, I like that person, but, not in the same sense of, I love them from an Eros perspective. Or I love my family. And so some of the meanings are close, but we literally use that one word to kind of cover an entire spectrum, an entire range. And it's essentially, unless we make it clear, it comes across as a more generic use of the word, right? It has kind of a generic meaning, and it's very emotional, right? You can have love for an object, or for a person. If we go back to that King James, the translation that was done originally for charity, what's the difference between love and charity if you go back and think about an earlier definition of that word? How that word would have been used at the time the King James was written, 1600s. What do we mean by charity these days?
Charity, you get nothing back.
Well, you get nothing back, but also what are we usually doing when we're thinking about, when we give to charity, what are we doing? We're giving, right? We're usually giving what?
Without expectation of return.
Yeah, but we're usually giving money. Or, we're doing a charitable contribution. Are you being charitable if you're handing money out to somebody who, has, a street up or a sign up and they're standing, on the curb asking for help? Okay? That's charity, and we usually think about that more today. That's kind of the context. So we talk about giving to a charitable nonprofit or United Way, or we're basically giving something to charity that is maybe being passed on because we're giving it to an organization and it's going to somebody else. And the word, the use of the term has kind of become more constrained, and I think a lot narrower today in current English. Which is why, if you look at that word kind of in the King James, it feels a little odd today. If you think about it as a translation, because the word there in Greek is in fact agape. So why would they have translated that in the 1600s as charity? Because at that point, it meant doing something for others. It had a broader context of being there for others, doing something for others. It was literally kind of, rather than using a generic term, love, charity had a different meaning and a little bit different context that wasn't the way you might have thought or used the term love, but it was literally more like philos. It was brotherhood. It was caring about other people. It was doing things for others, and that was kind of the context that was used in. The other thing that we end up with today that makes that a little bit tricky is charity can be anonymous. Okay, well, we're supposed to maintain some of that perspective as well, but it also tends to be oriented towards generically doing things or giving money to build wells in Africa, okay, or do things that are kind of helping people in general or giving to a food bank, etc. It can be generically about basically helping humanity, or we're going to contribute to kind of the common good, or we're going to go do generically feed the homeless in Chicago, right? All of which is good. But the idea of love, when you are looking at 1 Corinthians 13, I think is very specific in terms of it's if you think about the two greatest commandments and you go to the second one, which we'll hit in a minute, is that a generic commandment or is that specific? Love your neighbor as yourself. It's about an individual. It's about, I'm doing something for somebody specific here at church that is struggling or in need. It's about, doing something for your next door neighbor or somebody at work, or it's very specific and very directed and much more individual than generic or just doing something generically that's good. And I think that's the sense we're called to when we look at 1 Corinthians 13. And if you go back and read the characteristics of love, those are not generic. They're more targeted at how we deal with each other, what we're doing for others, what we're doing for the person sitting next to us or in the house next to us, or the person that we see that's struggling at work, or has lost a family member, et cetera, and how we respond to them. So I think that our sense of love coming out of 1 Corinthians 13 is very targeted in the sense of it's about an individual. It's about the people that we come in contact with as opposed to being generic. Doesn't mean that doing generic things that maybe feel like, being humanitarian is bad. But that's not the real context of love that comes out of 1 Corinthians 13. So we're gonna come back to that and just think about that, because I think that has a lot of practical implications. When we think about we're called to that response, we go back to faith, hope, and love, the natural reaction, the response that we should get. When we talk about doing things in love or loving others, it's active. It should motivate us to do things, but it actually should motivate us to do things specifically and targeted, and thinking about and kind of worried about the well-being of others. Hopefully my voice is going to hold up. So this goes back to, I was going to get there, Matthew, sooner or later. The four types of love that are used in Greek. So you have storge, which is closer to thinking about something like I like that. Okay. You have eros, which has sexual connotation, etc. And the actual kind of literal definition. I remember when I went through this the first time with a class of college students, and I spent the first couple of weeks of class. This was a class on dating and marriage that they asked for, and I spent the first 2 weeks convincing them that arranged marriages were actually a really good thing. Why would it be a good thing? When you're in love, how good's your logic? How good's your decision making? The actual kind of original definition of that word was temporary insanity. So think about that for a minute. Okay? That's more of the context than that. And then philos, which is, right, brotherly love. Okay? So we've talked about that quite a bit. We have a pretty good context for that. And that has a lot to do with, when we kind of look at some of the one another passages, that idea of kind of, brotherly love, which is great. It's maybe a little bit of a step down, but, it's heading the right direction. And then we have agape. And agape is literally thinking about and doing things for the benefit of another person before you. It's a deep and abiding love. It's not a pure emotional response, because we can emotionally respond to somebody and actually be doing the wrong thing for them. Now, is that love, or is that guilt, or is that, you can get into that whole debate. We've all talked about, in different contexts, enabling. Right? Enabling bad behavior with our kids. Letting them continue to, not holding them accountable. Okay? If we're enabling, you might argue that could fall under philos, as in, I'm trying to do good things and, et cetera. But is it really making hard decisions about what is really better for that other person? What is the right response? How do I really help them long term? Not, kind of in the immediate, but what am I really doing for them? Am I really thinking about kind of their long-term benefit and what's best for them? Okay? God's love for us is what? Agape. It's not about, what we prayed for that we want right now. It's about, what do we actually need long-term? What's going to move us to the right place? Right? What's going to help us in the long term? Go back to the sermon we had, a month or so ago about, what happens when God says no? It was a great question. good sermon that really challenges us to think about, maybe God has a better idea of what's good for us, and his love for us is what drives that. Because a lot of times it's easier to give in and just basically say, okay, if that's what they want, I'll just do it. But if it is actually not what's best for them, which is what takes it from a pure emotional response to it's a considered, reasoned response about what is the best thing for that person. And I think that's the depth of what comes out of agape when we think about kind of that word and how that's used, and go back up and again reread the characteristics of what love is and isn't prior to this in 1 Corinthians, and you start to come away with a little bit different perspective. So kind of think about the implications of running across those kind of four types of love, but particularly philos and agape. And what does it really mean when we talk about faith, hope, and love? Love is agape. This is one of my favorite passages, so everybody's heard me read it before, but it also fits in this context as well. 2 Peter 1, verse 5 to 7. And it's a key passage in terms of thinking about we're not baptized and then all of a sudden we're there, right? There's a journey, there's a building, there's a growth. You got to start from that basis of faith. You got to have the hope that drives kind of the growth. You got to continue to grow in knowledge, et cetera. And then the end of that chain comes back to agape. Okay? So let's read that. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness. That's a start. That's kind of getting us going in terms of goodness or kindness. To goodness, knowledge. So you continue to learn. That continues to drive growth. That continues to reinforce your faith and your hope. To knowledge, self-control. So you're beginning to kind of build some structure. Think about the context of, new Christians living in a pagan world. And the struggles they were going through to begin to kind of separate themselves from that old life. Self-control is an important part, but it's also very much embedded in the description of love in 1 Corinthians 13. To self-control, perseverance, right? That brings us back to, again, faith and hope as well. Continuing to push forward, continuing to have hope, continuing to kind of build on that base to persevere, to continue in the face of struggles, hard times, disappointment, et cetera. And to perseverance, godliness, okay? It's the idea of, again, step above goodness, becoming more and more committed to a life following Jesus, committed to being more godlike, to godliness, brotherly kindness. And what is the Greek word for brotherly kindness? Philos. So the word that's used there in 2 Peter is philos. Okay? And then what would you add on top of philos? Right? To brotherly kindness, love. Okay? So add to philos, agape. And that's literally kind of this building over time of our ability to actually show love to others, even tough love. Looking at and really thinking about what is the best I can do for someone. What is actually kind of, the real sense of showing love for them in terms of being concerned and focused on, what's best for them. So that's an easy kind of link right back to 1 Corinthians 13, the characteristics of love, and then recognizing the difference even there between philos and agape. Two different levels. You're going to build to that kind of more, maybe a little bit softer, we characterize it, brotherly love. Certainly kind of doing things for others, and maybe a little bit more generic sense to agape. A true response to God's love and sharing that same kind of level of depth to others, which is where we're going to come back to a discussion of Jesus' teachings around love your enemies. Okay, what does that really mean? Okay, that's a tough one. And, you know, it's where are we kind of on this development path that would allow us to literally be able to love people that we don't like. Okay, when we use that term love, we said, well, but I don't like them. Or Freud would say there are people that just are not likable. What's our required response to people even if we don't like them? Right? It's still to show love. And still to be looking at and thinking about, you know, what is the best thing for them and what do I do? Okay, wrapping up. As we kind of go from the kind of setup this week into both some practical and theological implications going into next week is, you know, if you go back to Mark 12 and just, you know, read 28 through 31, reread, you know, 1 Corinthians, think about kind of the broader implications. Jesus said, you know, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating, and noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, what is the most important? And we all know this, right? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. Okay, same word, Greek word used throughout that. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandment greater than these. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, there is some actual order to how we love that is pretty clear, certainly from Paul, but also from John, that, you know, we need to kind of build into that context. But that's where we're going to go. We're going to kind of get into thinking about kind of the practical implications and why, kind of following down that path of faith, hope, and love, why love is so hard. And where we are, and I would say go back and read 2 Peter as well, and then we'll come back and pick up from there next week. Let's close with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your love for us. We thank you that that is a part of your essence, that you created us, that you continue to love us no matter how many mistakes we make or what we do. And yet, you also hold us accountable even as you apply grace and forgiveness. We asked as we go through this study, and particularly building on the time we spent on faith and hope, that you would help us to have a better understanding of what it means to love like you, what it means to reflect your love to others, what it means to call that up out of our lives, out of our response, and not just respond as we feel, but respond based on our calling as children of yours. Continue to watch over us, be with us in all things. Help us to continue to grow closer to you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.